Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight you'll be treated to not one, but two unforgettable mysteries featuring Inspector Price of Scotland Yard. First, Murder on the Night Mail, a tale of intrigue aboard the overnight London-Edinburgh Express. Then the Mystery of Windmere Hall, where secrets stir within the walls of a grand country estate. If you love classic mysteries, you'll feel right at home here. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and join us each week for more Inspector Price mysteries, brought to you exclusively on this channel. The Murder on the Night Mail. Chapter 1. Departure at Dusk. The mist clung to the stone platforms of King's Cross like a stubborn shroud when Inspector Harold Price stepped from a cab and into the faint drizzle, his overcoat collar turned high against the wind. He had the appearance of a man travelling for business, but without hurry, though in truth the letter folded inside his coat pocket had brought him here at the earliest opportunity. It had been delivered without fanfare that morning, slid beneath his office door. The envelope was cheap and unmarked. The message inside, written in a careful but uneven hand, "Watch the night mail. Justice must ride tonight." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it, nor what manner of justice they meant. Price had read the note twice, set it down, and then, after a moment's stillness, begun to make arrangements. Now as he stepped onto the platform, the London-Edinburgh Express stood waiting, its black and cream carriages gleaming faintly under the lamps. He moved unhurriedly along the line of carriages, his sharp eyes taking in the passengers already boarding. Travel at this hour was a curious business, neither leisurely nor rushed, yet filled with an energy all its own. People embarking on overnight journeys were often tired, distracted, and, most useful to an investigator, unguarded. Near the first-class carriage, a tall man stood with his back to the platform, speaking in a low tone to a railway porter. Price knew him by sight from newspapers. Mr. Bartholomew Quince, financier and reclusive power broker, whose dealings were as opaque as his expression. Quince wore an overcoat of heavy black wool, a bowler hat pulled low over his brow, and an air of detached impatience, as though the very act of existing among others was a burden to him. Beside him, a young woman stood with a slim leather briefcase clutched to her chest. Her hair was neatly pinned beneath a small hat, and her eyes, alert, almost guarded, moved over the platform, as if weighing the trustworthiness of every passer-by. Price guessed this must be Miss Elsie Hart, Quince's secretary. A few paces down, another passenger was chatting with the guard, a rotund man in a brown travelling suit, his cheeks ruddy from drink or cheer, perhaps both. He introduced himself to anyone within earshot as Mr. Frederick Dunn, a commercial traveller in textiles. His laugh rang out above the hiss of steam, the sound warm yet slightly forced, as if he believed volume to be a form of charm. Further along, standing almost at the edge of the lamplight, was a young woman carrying a slim violin case. Miss Ada Morell was pale-faced and delicate, her eyes downcast, her gloved hands resting gently on the polished wood of the case as though it were a living thing. She looked, Price thought, like someone who preferred to listen rather than speak. Finally there was Colonel Avery, upright and spare, his posture ramrod straight even in the relaxed bustle of the platform. The sweep of his moustache was immaculate, and the polished brass of his walking cane caught the lamp's glow. Price recognised the type, soldiers who had brought their discipline back into civilian life and found the world wanting. The guard's whistle pierced the air, sharp and commanding. Porters made their final calls, and the last of the luggage was loaded aboard. Price stepped into the first-class carriage, nodding to the conductor. Inside, the compartment was warm and softly lit, the green baize seats inviting after the chill of the platform. The scent of coal smoke lingered faintly beneath that of leather and polished wood. Price took a seat near the corridor window, from which he could see the flickering lanterns outside. The train jolted gently as it began to move, the carriages swaying as they left the platform and rolled into the dark. The lamps overhead hummed softly, their light pooling on the brass fittings. Around him, the passengers settled into the rhythm of travel. Dunn ordering a nightcap from the steward, Elsie opening her briefcase to review a sheaf of papers, Ada's hands resting lightly on her violin case, Quince staring out into the night. Price leaned back, the letter's words replaying in his mind. Justice must ride tonight. The wheels clattered into their steady rhythm, the city giving way to the dark sweep of the countryside. Somewhere ahead, before the train reached Edinburgh, something would happen. Price intended to be ready for it. Chapter 2. The Locked Compartment. The London-Edinburgh Express had been running for several hours, the countryside long since claimed by the deep velvet of the night. Inspector Price had spent the early part of the journey in quiet observation. He moved occasionally between his seat and the corridor, exchanging polite nods with the passengers, but offering no hint of his true purpose. He noted small details, Elsie Hart's constant checking of her briefcase clasp, Dunn's generous pouring of his own brandy, Colonel Avery's upright stillness as he read from a small leather-bound volume, Ada Morell's silent, almost reverent polishing of her violin's bow. It was a little after midnight when the train began its run through a series of long tunnels. The lamps flickered faintly in the corridor, dimming each time the darkness outside pressed too closely. A porter passed through, checking compartment doors and murmuring to himself about the cold. Price was standing at the far end of the first-class carriage when the first commotion arose. A knock, sharp, insistent, echoed down the corridor, followed by the porter's voice. "Mr. Quince, sir? Are you awake?" There was no reply. The porter rapped again, louder this time. "Sir, the conductor's requesting a word." He paused, frowning, and tried the handle. It refused to move. The door was bolted from the inside. By now Elsie had stepped into the corridor, eyes bright with unease. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Price moved forward, his presence quiet but commanding. "Allow me," he said. He tried the handle himself, felt the resistance of the bolt, and then rapped hard on the panel. "Mr. Quince, it's Inspector Price. Open the door, if you please." Only silence answered. The porter fetched the guard, who produced a small brass key that opened the external lock, but the bolt inside still held fast. Price exchanged a glance with the guard, then reached for the transom window above the door. It was only slightly ajar, the latch stiff. With some effort, the guard pushed it open, far enough to insert a thin length of metal, a tool clearly designed for just such moments. A deft flick, and the bolt slid back with a reluctant click. The door swung inward. Quince sat slumped in the corner seat beneath the window, his head angled awkwardly against the panelling. His bowler hat had rolled to the floor. One hand lay palm up beside him, fingers loosely curled. In the soft light of the compartment lamp, the skin at the base of his skull bore a tiny, precise puncture mark, no more than the width of a pencil, but the unnatural stillness of his form left no doubt. Price stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the compartment in an instant. The window was latched. The door had been bolted. On the small folding table lay a glass of whiskey, untouched, and beside it a travel clock, stopped at 12:17. The faint scent of metal, sharp and cold, lingered in the air. Elsie gasped, covering her mouth. Dunn appeared behind her, his jovial expression replaced by a puzzled frown. Colonel Avery's face remained impassive, though his eyes seemed fixed on the wound at Quince's neck. Ada Morell hovered in the corridor, clutching her violin case a little too tightly. Price straightened slowly. "No one enters this compartment," he told the guard, "and no one leaves this carriage until I say so." The guard swallowed hard and nodded. As the train rattled onward into the dark, Price knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no accident. Whoever had killed Bartholomew Quince had done so inside a locked room, and yet had managed to vanish without a trace. Chapter 3. Corridor Alibis. The train thundered northward, and within the first-class carriage, the air had taken on a taut, brittle quality. Conversation was hushed. Footsteps in the corridor slowed to cautious shuffles. Inspector Price stood in the narrow corridor, one hand resting lightly on the brass rail, his eyes trained on the faces before him. There were not many passengers in this part of the train, 5 first-class travellers and a handful of railway staff. That small number meant one thing: the killer was almost certainly among them. The guard, still pale from the discovery, waited at Price's side with a notepad in hand. "We'll speak to each of them," Price murmured, "one at a time and quietly. No need for the rest of the carriage to eavesdrop." The porter ushered in the first, Mr. Frederick Dunn. The commercial traveller's cheeks were less ruddy now, his hands clasped together in a way that suggested either contrition or discomfort. "I was in the smoking lounge, he said, his voice carrying that same forced cheerfulness Price had noticed earlier. "Colonel Avery and I were playing a few hands of whist. Not much else to do at this hour, you know." "From when to when?" "Oh, good hour and a half, I should say. Well past midnight." "Did you leave the lounge at all?" "Only to fetch a cigar from my compartment. Quick as a flash, though. I'd have been gone less than a minute." Price's eyes narrowed. "And this was before or after we passed through the tunnels?" "Before, I think. Yes, before. Lamps flickered when we were in there, but we carried on playing." When Dunn stepped out, the colonel took his place. Avery was crisp and exact in his answers, the sort of man who prided himself on precision. "Mr. Dunn's account is correct," he said. "We played 3 games. He stepped away briefly, but I hardly noted the time." "You noticed the flicker of the lamps?" Avery inclined his head. "Yes. When the train entered the second tunnel, lasted no more than a few seconds. I dare say the lamps are due for maintenance." Next came Elsie Hart. She was pale but steady-eyed. "I was in the dining car," she said, "going through Mr. Quince's correspondence. He asked me to review some contracts overnight. I had them spread out over a table, along with my typewriter case. I didn't leave until I heard the porter knocking on his door." Price studied her closely. "You had no reason to visit him after supper?" "No," she said quickly. Then after a beat, "He preferred not to be disturbed in the evenings." The last to be called was Miss Ada Morell. She perched on the edge of the seat, as though ready to flee at any moment, her gloved hands wrapped tightly around her violin case. "I was in my compartment," she said softly, "tuning my violin. I always practice before a performance, scales, exercises. The walls aren't very thick, so perhaps someone heard." "Did you notice anything unusual during the tunnels?" She hesitated. "Only that the lights went out for a moment, and I heard footsteps in the corridor. But that's nothing strange, is it?" Before Price could reply, there was a small voice at the far end of the carriage. A girl no more than 10 was standing there, with a mop of dark curls and a woolen shawl wrapped about her shoulders. "Excuse me, sir," she said, looking up at him with wide eyes. "When it went dark, I peeked out the door. I saw a hand. It was pulling down Mr. Quince's blind." A stillness swept over the corridor. Price crouched to her level. "A hand, you say? Could you tell if it was a man's or a woman's?" She shook her head. "Just a shadow. Then it was gone." Price rose slowly, his mind turning over the image. A shadowy hand at Quince's blind, seen during the brief blackout. The question was not only who that hand belonged to, but how it had reached a man locked inside his compartment. Chapter 4. The Violin's Secret. Morning was still hours away, but the train felt as though it had settled into a tense, wakeful night. Price lingered near the end of the first-class carriage, his hands in his overcoat pockets, replaying the accounts he had just gathered. Every alibi fit neatly into place, too neatly. The blackout had lasted no more than half a minute, yet it was long enough for a quick, deliberate act. The child's observation gnawed at him. A hand at the blind, seen in that tiny window of darkness, was the only thread that connected the locked compartment to the world outside. Price turned his attention to the corridor floor, where the carpet's dark weave was broken in one small patch by a faint scattering of pale dust. He crouched, brushing a finger over it. The particles clung lightly to the fabric of his glove, gritty yet fine. Rosin dust, the kind used by violinists to give bite to the bow's hair. He straightened and glanced down the corridor toward Miss Ada Morell's compartment. She was inside, the door ajar, her violin resting on her lap as she ran the bow slowly across the strings. The soft notes barely rose above the hum of the train. Price rapped gently on the door frame. "Miss Morell, may I?" She looked up quickly, then nodded, shifting the violin aside. "Do you travel often with your instrument?" he asked, stepping inside. "Whenever I'm booked to play," she said quietly. "It's my livelihood, Inspector." He glanced at the polished case resting on the seat beside her. It was a handsome piece of work, the wood dark with a satin sheen, brass hinges catching the lamplight. Yet his eye was drawn to a narrow fissure running along the inner lining when she opened it to place the violin inside. Price reached toward it. "May I?" At her hesitant nod, he slid a fingertip into the crack and felt something firm beneath the padding. With careful pressure, he lifted a thin, collapsible length of metal, no longer than his forearm when extended, with a small hook at the end. Ada's breath caught. "What is this?" Price asked, his voice calm but pointed. She bit her lip. "It's mine. I had it made in Paris. She broke off, her voice faltering. "Go on." "I owed Mr. Quince money. Not much, but enough for him to threaten my engagement in Edinburgh if I didn't pay at once. I thought, if I could get into his compartment while he slept, I might take a ledger, or some proof of what he'd done to others. I never intended to kill him," Price finished. She shook her head vehemently. "Never. I only meant to retrieve the papers, but I never used it tonight. I stayed in here the entire time. You can ask anyone who passed. I was playing the violin when the lights went out." Price examined the rod closely. It was light, collapsible, and designed to reach up through a transom or narrow opening. The hook was delicate, but strong enough to lift a bolt from inside a door. It was, he thought, the first concrete link between the locked room and the corridor outside. He slid the rod back into the case lining and closed it gently. "You'll remain here for now, Miss Morell," he said, "and I advise you not to open this case again until I tell you." As he stepped into the corridor, Price felt the first stirrings of a plan forming. If someone had used this device, they could have entered Quince's compartment in silence, committed the murder, and left without leaving so much as a smudge on the brass. The trick now would be to prove whose hand had wielded it. Chapter 5. Paper Trails. By the time Inspector Price returned to Quince's locked compartment, the guard had stationed himself outside like a sentry, barring entry to anyone curious enough to linger. The compartment still smelled faintly of stale tobacco and the sharper tang of cold metal, the air undisturbed since Price's earlier examination. Quince's body, now respectfully covered with a railway blanket, lay as it had been found, head slumped to one side. Price's eyes moved beyond the man to the small details: the placement of his coat on the overhead rack, the scuff on the heel of one polished boot, the faint indentation on the cushion opposite where a satchel had rested earlier in the evening. He began a methodical search, working through the inside pockets of Quince's coat. In the left inner breast pocket, his fingers brushed something slim and hard. He drew out a small notebook bound in dark leather, the edges worn, but the spine surprisingly stiff. Price opened it. The pages were lined in neat columns of figures, interspersed with names and dates, but the entries were written in a code. Each line bore a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to the untrained eye. Leafing through the book, Price noticed repetition, the same handful of initials appearing against substantial sums. A few of the entries had an asterisk beside them, and at the bottom of one page, a name had been written in full, unencoded, then scratched out so hard the paper was almost torn. He stepped back into the corridor and beckoned Elsie Hart. She came stiffly, still holding her briefcase as though it were a shield. "This was in Mr. Quince's pocket," Price said, holding up the notebook. "You've seen it before." Her eyes flicked to the book, then away. "Yes, I was not supposed to, but I noticed it when he asked me to pack some things for a previous trip. It contains the payments." "Payments to whom?" "To a company called Galloway Holdings, But it isn't a company. It's a shell inspector. Funds went in and out. No record of goods or services. I believe—" She hesitated, her lips tightening. "I believe he was moving money to accounts abroad. Embezzlement. And you?" "I wanted to expose him, but I was afraid." Her hands gripped the briefcase harder. "My signature is on some of the transfers. He made sure of that. If he went down, I would be implicated." Price studied her. The fear in her voice was real, but fear could live alongside other, darker emotions: anger, desperation, revenge. "Where were you when the blackout occurred?" "In the dining car. My papers were spread out on the table. I never left until I heard the commotion." He let her go, closing the notebook and slipping it into his own coat pocket. The code, he knew, could be unravelled, especially with the right help once they reached Edinburgh. But already it was a thread leading outward from Quince's murder, through finances and fraud, toward anyone desperate enough to silence him permanently. Yet the method of the killing still hung over the case like fog. The rod in Ada Morell's violin case could have unlocked the door. The blackout provided the cover. The ledger provided a motive for at least one person. But there was still the matter of that stopped clock, its hands fixed stubbornly at 12:17, a detail that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. Price stepped back into the corridor, the murmur of the rails filling his ears. The truth was here, sealed inside this train with him, somewhere between the clatter of the wheels and the sway of the carriage, and it was getting closer. Chapter 6. The Phantom Hand. The night train's carriages creaked and swayed, each lurch seeming to mirror the unease building inside the first-class compartment. Inspector Price stood alone in the narrow corridor, replaying in his mind the facts as they stood. Quince dead from a precise puncture wound at the base of the skull. Door bolted from the inside, window latched. A blackout lasting barely 30 seconds. A child's testimony of a hand drawing back the blind. Rosin dust on the carpet. A collapsible hooked rod hidden in Ada Morell's violin case. The scene had the elegance of a puzzle box. Somewhere, concealed within, was the mechanism that made it all work. Price returned to Quince's compartment. With the guard's reluctant help, he began to reconstruct the crime. The guard climbed onto a stool in the corridor, pushing open the narrow transom window above the compartment door. Price handed him the rod from Ada's case. With a little manoeuvring, the hook caught the inner bolt. A subtle lift and click, the bolt slid free. They stepped inside. Price imagined the murderer's movements. The train plunges into the tunnel, the lights flicker out. Using the rod, the killer slips in through the now unlocked door. Quince, perhaps dozing, has little time to react before a sharp letter spike, like the sort favoured for opening correspondence, drives home with a single, practised thrust. The killer turns, slips back into the corridor, and, using the rod once more, rebolts the door from the outside. In the brief confusion of darkness, the act passes unnoticed. By the time the lights steady, the killer is gone, and the compartment appears undisturbed. But the stopped clock at 12:17 troubled Price still. It was too calculated, an unnatural stillness in the middle of an otherwise chaotic scene. Someone had wanted him to believe that was the time of death, narrowing the window of opportunity to those not in plain view. He stared at the small brass clock on the table. Winding it back to 12:17 would take only a few seconds for someone practiced. If that person also possessed a military mind, one accustomed to timing and precision, they could construct an alibi without even leaving the corridor. Price let the rod rest on the seat and stepped back into the passage. The faces of the suspects came to him in sequence, but one in particular seemed to hold the balance between discipline, resourcefulness, and personal grievance. Colonel Avery. Avery, who had played whist with Dunn, stepping away from the lounge just long enough to retrieve— what? A borrowed tool from Ada's unattended compartment? Avery, whose measured movements and calm manner might hide the memory of an old injustice. Price did not yet have proof, but the phantom hand in the blackout was beginning to take on a shape, and he intended to see its owner unmasked before the train reached Edinburgh. Chapter 7. Time runs backward. The Edinburgh dawn was still a promise beyond the horizon when Inspector Price gathered the first-class passengers in the dining car. Outside the windows, the night pressed close, broken only by the rhythmic streak of telegraph poles and the faint glow of station lamps as the train roared through the sleeping countryside. The guard lingered by the door, his eyes flicking nervously between the assembled travellers. Price stood at the head of the carriage, hands clasped loosely behind his back. Mr. Quince's death, he began, was a locked-room puzzle, a bolted door, a latched window, and yet a witness saw a hand at the blind during the blackout. That, ladies and gentlemen, was the first thread. His gaze moved to Ada Morell. The second was Miss Morell's concealed rod, a tool capable of lifting a bolt through a transom. She admitted to planning a theft, but my inquiries have proved she never left her compartment during the blackout. Several passengers heard her playing the violin in that precise window of time. Which means someone else used the rod. Elsie shifted uneasily. Dunn coughed into his hand. Price's eyes settled on Colonel Avery. "Colonel, you were playing whist with Mr. Dunn, yet there was a brief moment, less than a minute, when Mr. Dunn left to fetch a cigar. Conveniently, the lights failed soon after. That was when you excused yourself, was it not? A soldier knows the value of timing, and you used that minute to slip into Miss Morell's compartment, take the rod, and unlock Quince's door." Avery's moustache twitched. "This is absurd, Inspector." "Is it? You entered in darkness, struck Quince with a sharpened letter spike, and left before the lamp steadied. Then you rebolted the door from outside, ensuring it appeared untouched. But you went further. You wound back Quince's travel clock to 12:17. That false time of death narrowed suspicion onto those unaccounted for then, chiefly Miss Hart." Price stepped forward, voice hardening. "Years ago, Mr. Quince destroyed your regiment's pension through one of his investments. Many of your men died poor. Tonight, you sought justice of your own making." The Colonel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence was as good as admission. Price turned to Ada. "Miss Morell's involvement ends with her poor judgment in concealing such a device. She sought only to take ledgers, proving her brother's debts were exploited. She never entered Quince's compartment." Ada's eyes brimmed with relief and shame. Price straightened. "Colonel Avery, you will surrender your weapon and accompany the guard when we arrive in Edinburgh." For a moment, Avery's eyes held Price's, a glint of defiance in their steel-grey depths. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his coat and laid the letter spike on the table. The train rattled onward, carrying them all toward the pale light of morning. Justice, Price knew, was rarely as simple as guilt and innocence, but as Edinburgh's first signals flashed in the distance, the phantom hand had found its owner, and the night mail had delivered its final reckoning. Story 2. The Mystery of Windmere Hall. Chapter 1. The Unfinished Dance. The December night lay heavy over the Sussex coastline, a damp sea mist drifting in from the Channel and creeping up the gravel drive of Windmere Hall. Inside, the ballroom of the hall was a vision of elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast a shimmer over the parquet floor, where ladies in silk gowns and gentlemen in evening tails moved with practised grace. The occasion was the annual Winter Charity Ball, hosted by Lady Imogen Windmere, philanthropist, art patron, and to her acquaintances, an indomitable force of charm. She was a tall, willowy woman in her late 50s. For decades, this evening had been the pinnacle of the county's winter social calendar. But tonight, the tradition would be shattered. It happened in the middle of the second waltz. Lady Imogen was dancing with her nephew and heir, Miles Windmere, a broad-shouldered man of 35, with an expression perpetually caught between boredom and faint irritation. They were halfway across the floor when her steps faltered. She clutched at Miles's arm, her lips parting as though to speak, but the words never came. Her knees buckled, and the music screeched to a halt as she crumpled to the floor. Gasps erupted. The crowd surged forward, forming a ring around the prone figure. Miles knelt beside her, pale and bewildered. "Someone fetch Dr. Albright," called Captain Charles Lyell, a sun-bronzed man with a faint moustache and the easy confidence of an aviator used to applause. The doctor, already in attendance, hurried forward and bent over Lady Imogen, his brow furrowing. A moment later, he straightened, his voice grave. "She's gone." There was a stunned silence broken only by the faint tinkle of a glass rolling on the floor. A half-finished crystal goblet of crème de menthe, the pale green liquid catching the light. Inspector Harold Price of Scotland Yard arrived, summoned by a hastily telephoned request from the local constabulary. Price, tall and broad, with a neatly trimmed moustache, and the kind of calm that steadied lesser men, was accustomed to death. Yet the sight that greeted him was striking enough to give even him pause. Lady Imogen's body had been discreetly moved to a chaise longue in an adjoining salon, a shawl draped over her slender frame. The ballroom was hushed now, the musicians dismissed, the guests gathered in uneasy clusters along the walls. The butler, Mr. Hardwick, spare, formal, and with the solemnity of a cathedral verger, stepped forward to greet Price. "Inspector, this is most distressing. Lady Imogen was in fine spirits all evening until—" He gestured helplessly toward the salon. Price's dark eyes missed little. He noted the scattered pearls on the parquet near where she had fallen. A necklace broken in the commotion, perhaps, but curiously, the clasp appeared bent rather than merely snapped. He glanced toward the conservatory doors on the far side of the room. The fernery beyond was dim, its glass panes misted over, but on the threshold there was a faint smudge of whitish powder. "Best that no one disturbs anything in here," Price said quietly, his voice low but carrying. "I'd like to see the body." In the salon, Dr. Albright stood by the chaise, his hands clasped behind him. "No sign of a seizure, Inspector," he said. Her breathing ceased quite suddenly. There's a faint smell about her lips. Bitter almonds, perhaps. I would wager on cyanide, though we'll need confirmation. Price glanced at the glass of crème de menthe on a side table, its surface catching the lamplight. He bent to examine it, then straightened, his expression unreadable. "Tell me," he said to the doctor, "who poured this drink?" "That I cannot say. The footmen were serving trays in the ballroom, but I should note Lady Imogen seldom drank spirits. The crème de menthe was unusual." When Price returned to the ballroom, the guests were being ushered into the library to await questioning. He studied them as they filed past. Miles Windmere, face pale but set, his jaw tight. Beatrice Charrington, a handsome woman of 40 with an air of brisk self-possession, her dark eyes meeting his with frank appraisal. Captain Lyell smiling faintly, as though determined to project good cheer in a time of gloom. And Miss Reeves, Lady Imogen's companion, neat, plain and quietly anxious, her gloved hands twisting a lace handkerchief. Each looked at him differently, some curious, some wary, some faintly defiant. Price knew the evening's gaiety had been only a veneer. Beneath the glitter of the chandeliers, secrets had been circling the floor long before the dance had ended, and now one of them had danced its way into murder. Chapter 2. Footprints in the Fernery. Inspector Price preferred to begin an inquiry at the scene of the crime, before the memory of it faded into the guests' conflicting recollections. He had learned that ballrooms, like battlefields, grew less reliable as hours passed and emotions cooled. With the guests now gathered in the library under the discreet watch of Constable Harker, Price turned his attention back to the ballroom. The scent of crushed petals and beeswax polish still hung in the air, mingling with a faint undertone of something acrid and metallic, an aftertaste of the tragedy that had occurred there. The parquet floor was scuffed with the traces of dancing, light swirls from slippered shoes, darker smudges from polished brogues. But Price's eyes were drawn to the far end of the room, where the double doors led into the conservatory. He crossed the room in unhurried steps, his polished shoes clicking softly. On the marble threshold, he stopped and crouched, peering at the faint dusting of whitish powder he had noticed earlier. He dipped a fingertip into it, rubbing the grains gently between forefinger and thumb. Not dust, too coarse, possibly residue from crushed tablets, or the chalky base of a medicinal powder. Rising, he pushed the conservatory doors open. A breath of damp, earthy air met him, rich with the scent of soil and fern fronds. The conservatory's gas lamps glowed dimly, throwing long shadows across the tiled floor. In the far corner, beyond a cluster of potted palms, a wooden bench sat half hidden. It was the floor tiles, however, that held his interest. A series of faint marks, slightly darker than the surrounding dampness, led inward from the ballroom. The prints were narrow, pointed at the toe, ladies' evening shoes by the look of them, and the depth suggested a wearer of light build. The tracks halted abruptly beside the bench, where the tiles were faintly scratched, as if a heel had turned sharply. Price stooped, examining the bench. Its surface was bare except for a single, crumpled paper napkin. The faint green stain along one edge could have been from leaves, or from a liqueur such as crème de menthe. A quiet cough behind him broke the silence. Price turned to see Mr. Hardwick, the butler, framed in the doorway. His long face was impassive, but his eyes flicked warily toward the tiled floor. "I thought it best to inform you, Inspector," the butler said in his measured tones, "that the conservatory was not part of the public rooms for tonight's festivities. Lady Imogen gave orders. It was to remain closed." "Closed?" Price repeated mildly. "Yet the door was not locked." "I had it locked earlier this afternoon, sir. I can only suppose someone opened it after the guests began arriving. It is unusual. Lady Imogen was fond of the ferns, but she disliked them being handled during parties." Price's gaze sharpened. "And who held keys to the conservatory?" "Only myself, Lady Imogen, and Miss Reeves," Hardwick replied without hesitation. "And," he paused fractionally, "Miles Windmere. As master of the estate, he has a master key to all rooms." Leaving the conservatory, Price walked slowly back toward the spot where Lady Imogen had fallen. From here, he could see the pearls scattered across the parquet floor. He crouched again, lifting the bent clasp between finger and thumb. It had been twisted, perhaps wrenched in haste. But if the break occurred during her collapse, why was one end of the necklace clasp still faintly dusted with the same powder he had found on the conservatory threshold? The puzzle pieces were only beginning to emerge. A locked conservatory ordered closed for the night. Powder traces at its door, and on a broken necklace clasp, a bench with a faint green stain hidden among the ferns. By the time Price returned to the library, the hum of nervous conversation had dimmed to uneasy silence. The guests sat in varied postures of impatience, grief, or concealed irritation. Miles stood apart at the mantel, hands clasped behind his back. Beatrice leafed idly through a magazine she clearly was not reading. Captain Lyle toyed with his cufflinks. Miss Reeves stared into her lap. Price took a moment to let the weight of his presence settle on the room before speaking. "I have a few questions," he began evenly, "and I should like to start with the matter of the conservatory. Which of you, this evening, entered it, despite Lady Imogen's orders that it remain closed?" The silence that followed was not merely of ignorance. It was the silence of people deciding which truths were safe to share. And Price, with long experience, knew it was always in that hesitation that the first real clue was hiding. Chapter 3. Portraits and Pasts. The Windmere Portrait Gallery stretched along the west wing, a long, high-ceilinged corridor lined with ancestral faces. Moonlight from the tall windows mingled with the warm glow of the wall sconces, casting elongated shadows across the crimson carpet. Inspector Price often found such rooms revealing, not for what they displayed, but for the careful choices of what they omitted. The gallery told a story in oil and gilt. Windmeres in powdered wigs, Windmeres in military scarlet, Windmeres in hunting pinks with hounds at heel. Here and there, the same object reappeared. A lavish sapphire necklace, deep blue stones framed in diamond florets, resting on the bosoms of several family matriarchs across generations. He slowed before the most recent portrait, dated 1898, Lady Imogen in her youth, wearing the necklace with a serene smile. But even without being a trained art expert, Price noticed something odd. The paintwork around the necklace was faintly dulled compared to the surrounding pigments, as though it had been altered after the portrait was completed. He leaned in, his keen eye tracing the edges of the sapphires. A tiny irregularity in the outline betrayed a retouch. The painter's original brushwork had been covered, perhaps to subtly alter the depiction of the jewel. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Price turned to see Beatrice Charrington standing a few paces away. She held a small glass of champagne, though her lips had not touched it. "The necklace?" he asked mildly. She smiled faintly. "Family treasure. It's been with the Windmeres since the reign of George III. Lady Imogen kept it locked in her dressing-room safe." "And yet," Price observed, "I noticed she did not wear it tonight." Beatrice's eyes flickered, so slight it might have passed unnoticed by a less practiced observer. "It was too ostentatious for a charity ball, perhaps. Imogen was careful about appearances." Price stepped closer to the portrait. "You've known Lady Imogen all your life?" "Since I was a girl," Beatrice replied smoothly. She stopped, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second. She was formidable, not easily swayed. Price filed that away. People often revealed more in what they stopped themselves from saying than in what they did. Further down the gallery, he found Miles Windmere gazing out of a window at the misty lawns. The young man's hands were buried in his pockets, his jaw set in a brooding line. "Inspector," Miles said without turning, "have you any idea who could have done this?" "I'm still in the business of collecting ideas," Price replied. "Tell me, has the family necklace been in the safe lately?" Miles looked at him then, his expression guarded. "Of course. Why?" Price studied him for a moment. "Because in my experience, such heirlooms have a way of attracting trouble, and sometimes trouble follows not the object itself, but the secrets tied to it." Miles's gaze flicked toward the portrait of his aunt, then back to the dark lawns. "If you're implying someone would kill for that necklace, Inspector, I suggest you widen your net. In this family, money and jewels are only part of the story." As Price made his way back toward the ballroom, the image of the altered portrait lingered in his mind, and along with it many questions like, why repaint the necklace? Why was it not worn tonight? Chapter 4. The Companion's Whisper. The library at Windmere Hall was not a warm room. It was handsome, to be sure, lined from floor to ceiling with books bound in rich calfskin, the fire flickering in a wide stone hearth, but there was a chill that came creeping through the old sash windows. Miss Reeves sat apart from the others, in a high-backed armchair near the hearth, her slight frame half lost in its carved oak embrace. She was twisting a lace handkerchief in her gloved hands, her eyes fixed on the patterned carpet. The other guests kept their distance, as though she carried some invisible mark of guilt or grief. Inspector Price crossed the room, stopping before her chair. "Miss Reeves," he said gently, "I wonder if you would accompany me for a moment, somewhere quieter." Her eyes lifted, and he saw the faintest hesitation. "If you think it necessary, Inspector." They stepped into the smaller morning room. The door clicked shut behind them, muting the low murmur of the library. Price indicated a chair, then remained standing, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "You were Lady Imogen's companion for how long?" 7 years, she replied softly. "I handled her correspondence, her appointments, her household accounts." "And her confidences?" Miss Reeves's lips trembled in the faintest of smiles. "When she chose to share them, yes." Price regarded her for a moment, then said, "You have a key to the conservatory. Did you use it tonight?" Her eyes flickered downward. "No, Inspector, not tonight. Lady Imogen forbade it." "Yet I believe you're withholding something from me, something connected to her death." Miss Reeves's composure wavered. Her hands stilled on the crumpled lace. Yes, there is something. For the past fortnight, I have been intercepting letters, threatening ones. Lady Imogen instructed me to keep them from the servants and the post-bag. Price's voice was very quiet. What sort of threats? They demanded the return of what was promised. No signature, no address, only a London postmark. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank or the work of a lunatic. But the last letter, she swallowed. It said she had only until the night of the ball to make amends, or she would regret it. Price leaned forward slightly. And what was promised? Miss Reeves hesitated for so long that he could hear the faint ticking of the mantel clock. I do not know for certain, but I suspect it concerned the sapphire necklace. Lady Imogen had spoken of it less often in recent months, and 3 days ago she had me arrange for a jeweller from Brighton to come, privately, in the afternoon. Afterwards she seemed unsettled. Do you know what the jeweller told her? Miss Reeves shook her head. Only that when he left, she ordered the conservatory closed. She said it was to prevent guests from wandering where they should not. Price's mind drew a quiet line between these points. The necklace, the jeweller's visit, the locked conservatory, the threatening letters. One last thing, Miss Reeves, he said. You mentioned the phrase, what was promised. Did Lady Imogen ever suggest she had made such a promise? Miss Reeves's gaze dropped to her lap. Once, she said finally, months ago. We were in the gallery, and she was looking at her own portrait. She said, a promise can become a chain, Margaret, and some chains grow heavier with time. I thought it a passing remark. I see now I was wrong. The murder at Windmere Hall was no crime of passion, no spur-of-the-moment quarrel turned deadly. It had roots buried deep in the past, and someone, perhaps more than one someone, had been nursing those roots until they bloomed into poison. Chapter 5. The Aviator's Alibi. Inspector Price found Captain Charles Lyell exactly where he had expected, in the billiard room, cue in hand, idly sending balls across the green baize in slow, deliberate shots. Lyell looked up as Price entered, flashing the kind of smile that had likely opened many doors. Inspector, he said smoothly, I gather you're making the rounds. Shall I prepare my statement? Price closed the door behind him. That would be sensible. You danced with Lady Imogen earlier this evening, did you not? Indeed, twice in fact. She was a graceful partner. Lyell set down the cue and leaned lightly against the table. Then, as you no doubt know, I stepped outside to the aerodrome. Ah, yes, Price said. Your flight. Tell me again about that. Lyell's eyes lit up with the rehearsed gleam of a man who loved speaking about his own exploits. Routine maintenance on my de Havilland Moth. I'd promised the local flying club a demonstration tomorrow, but she was running rough, carburettor trouble. I took her up for a brief circuit, just to listen to the engine at load. Price nodded slowly. And the aerodrome log? A minor mix-up, Lyell said with a careless shrug. I jotted the time incorrectly and had to cross it out. No conspiracy, I assure you. Price moved to the sideboard, where a cut-glass decanter of brandy caught the lamplight. And yet, he said, you returned rather sooner than one might expect for an engine test. Lyell's smile thinned. It was bitterly cold at altitude, Inspector. A man knows when to cut a flight short. Price reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small evidence envelope. From it, he produced a polished silver cufflink, oval, with a small greenish smear along its edge. Do you recognise this? He asked. Lyell's gaze flicked to the cufflink and back. It's mine, yes. Must have come loose during the evening. It was found, Price said evenly, on the marble threshold of the conservatory. Then I must have passed that way, Lyell replied lightly, though his voice had lost a shade of its warmth. That is interesting, Price said, because the conservatory was supposed to be closed to guests, and because the green residue on your cufflink matches the powder found there. Powder which, I suspect, came from the rim of Lady Imogen's glass. For the first time, Lyell looked less the confident aviator and more the man calculating the risks before him. Inspector, he said at last, you're chasing shadows. I stepped into the conservatory for a breath of cooler air. The ballroom was stifling. I didn't linger, and I certainly didn't tamper with any drinks. Price studied him a moment longer, then slipped the cufflink back into its envelope. That will be for me to determine, Captain. In the meantime, I advise you not to stray too far from the hall. As he left the billiard room, Price knew one thing for certain. Captain Lyle's alibi, like the aerodrome log, was built for show, and somewhere behind that easy smile was a truth the captain was not ready to tell. Chapter 6. A Toast to Deception. By mid-morning the next day, the snow had begun to fall in slow drifting flakes, settling over the lawns of Windmere Hall. Inspector Price had already spoken with the household staff twice. Each time, the answers had been polite, measured, and not quite satisfactory. Now in the drawing-room, he faced the butler, Mr. Hardwick, the housemaids Elsie and Janet, and 2 footmen, all arrayed like chess pieces, awaiting his move. "Let us speak plainly," Price began. "Lady Imogen's glass of crème de menthe did not arrive in her hand by chance. I want to know exactly how the drinks were served in the moments before she collapsed." Hardwick's voice was level. "The footman carried 2 trays through the ballroom, sir. One with champagne, the other with liqueurs. I took care with the order. The liqueur tray was intended for the far side of the room." "But it did not reach the far side," Price said. "Why?" The younger footman, Wilkes, shifted uneasily. "Begging your pardon, sir, but during the second waltz, the lights flickered. Just for a moment. The chandelier dimmed, the orchestra hesitated. I changed course. I thought to offer drinks to the dancers who had stopped." "And in that confusion," Price said, "the trays switched hands." Hardwick frowned. "I recall that, sir. The champagne tray was taken by Wilkes and the liqueur tray passed to Perkins." Price paced slowly. "Now consider this. Lady Imogen seldom drank spirits, yet she took a glass of crème de menthe without hesitation. Why?" Elsie the maid spoke up hesitantly. "Because, if I may, sir, Mr. Miles always took one after dancing. A little habit of his." "Precisely," Price said. "If you wished to poison Miles, you could prepare 1 glass of crème de menthe with cyanide along the rim, knowing it would be his. But if, in the confusion of a lighting flicker and a tray swap, Lady Imogen reached for it first." He crossed to the sideboard where the decanters stood, and from his coat pocket drew a small glass vial of the whitish powder he had collected from the conservatory threshold. "This powder," he said, "is not garden dust. It is crushed potassium cyanide tablets, once used in photography and metalwork, now more often found in laboratories, or, interestingly, in certain aviation supply kits for cleaning spark plugs. It adheres easily to glass." He turned to face the room. "The question is, who had the opportunity to place it there and the presence of mind to exploit the momentary darkness to switch the trays?" Hardwick's brows drew together. "The flicker, it was most unusual. The gaslight system is generally reliable." "Not when someone tampers with the junction box," Price said. "I examined it this morning. The timing was too perfect to be chance." From the far end of the room, Captain Lyle appeared in the doorway, his expression guarded. "Inspector, are you suggesting that a minor electrical hiccup was murder in disguise?" Price met his gaze evenly. "I am suggesting, Captain, that the darkness was engineered, and that in those few seconds, the glass meant for Miles Windmere found its way to Lady Imogen's hand." Lyle's jaw tightened. "That's a long chain of suppositions." "Not as long as you think," Price replied, "especially when one recalls where your cufflink was found and what kind of powder was on it." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Price dismissed the staff and lingered a moment at the window, watching the snow fall more thickly now, muting the outlines of the gardens and the conservatory beyond. The killer's plan had been clever. Target one person, cloak the deed in the chaos of a sudden lighting failure, then trust the inevitability of confusion. But clever plans had a flaw, and in this one, the flaw was a single moment of human instinct. Lady Imogen. seeing her nephew's glass, taking it without a thought. It was that moment which had left a trail of evidence Price could now follow straight to the truth. Chapter 7. The waltz was for two. Inspector Price summoned everyone to the drawing room. The fire roared in the grate, throwing a golden glow over the assembled faces, but the warmth did nothing to ease the taut air of expectancy. They came reluctantly, Miles Windmere with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his expression set, Beatrice Charrington erect and composed, her dark eyes sharp, Captain Lyle with that same faint, challenging smile, Miss Reeves pale and anxious, clutching her handkerchief. Mr. Hardwick lingered at the doorway, as though reluctant to witness what was about to unfold. Price stood with his back to the fire, the faint hiss and pop of burning logs punctuating his words. Lady Imogen Windmere, Price began, was not the intended victim. The poisoned glass was meant for her nephew, Miles. A ripple of surprise crossed the group, though Beatrice's gaze did not falter. She rarely drank spirits, Price continued, but Miles had a habit, 1 glass of creme de menthe after dancing. Whoever prepared the glass knew this. The poison, potassium cyanide, was applied in powdered form to the rim, a method quick enough to act before a dance could end. He let his gaze sweep the room. The plan relied on one simple certainty. Miles would take the drink, but fate intervened. In the confusion of the lighting flicker engineered at the junction box, the drinks tray was diverted. Lady Imogen, perhaps wishing to steady herself after the dance, took her nephew's glass instead. Next, Price moved to the small table where he had laid the items of evidence, the bent pearl clasp, the cufflink, the vial of white powder. The powder was also found on the conservatory threshold, where the killer briefly retreated after applying it. Why the conservatory? Because it had been ordered closed, making it the one place in the house where they could act without risk of being observed. He glanced at Lyle. Your cufflink placed you there, Captain, but not at the right moment. You entered after the crime, perhaps curious or opportunistic, but you were not the one to poison the glass. Lyle exhaled slowly, his smile returning, though more subdued this time. Which brings us to the motive, Price said. He crossed to the portrait of Lady Imogen on the wall. The Windmere sapphire necklace. In this portrait, it has been altered, not to flatter, but to hide a truth, that the real necklace has been gone for some time, replaced by a clever forgery. Miss Reeves gasped softly. 3 days ago, Lady Imogen summoned a jeweller from Brighton. He confirmed her suspicion. The necklace in her safe was a fake. She planned to reveal the truth to the family at the ball and name the person who had stolen and replaced it. Price's gaze fell squarely on Beatrice Charrington. Beatrice's voice was cool. And you believe that person to be me? I do, Price said. You had the means, access to the safe on more than one occasion, and the motive. Years ago, you sold the real necklace to cover debts. The forgery was good enough to fool most eyes, but not forever. When you learned Lady Imogen had consulted a jeweller, you realised she would expose you. Her fingers tightened on the arm of her chair. So you think I arranged all this, simply to keep a secret? Not simply. You arranged the lighting failure, ensuring the trays would cross paths. You took the poisoned glass from the conservatory, intending it for Miles, the only other person who knew of the forgery. He had told Lady Imogen the truth just days earlier, hoping she would forgive you. But your plan faltered when Lady Imogen, by pure chance, drank from the wrong glass. There was a long pause. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock on the mantel. Then Price added, "There is one more thing. Lady Imogen had already decided not to denounce you publicly. She meant to return the forgery to you quietly after the ball, on the condition that you leave Windmere Hall for good. She had even written the letter, now in my possession, setting out her terms. But what would she know? That you would choose murder over shame." Beatrice's composure cracked, just slightly, in the faintest tightening around the eyes. She did not speak. Price straightened. "The choice is no longer yours, Mrs. Charrington. The snow may keep us here until morning, but by tomorrow you will be in the custody of the Crown. The room was silent. Outside, the snow swirled against the tall windows, covering the hall in white, as though trying, in vain, to hide the darkness within.